I want us to become brothers again like we used to be, and for us to find ourselves and bond with each other. Can we agree to that?
Opinions vary.
Welcome to Three Brothers Filmcast. I'm Aaron, and I'm here with my brothers,
Anders
and Anton.
My last name is the same as my brother's.
And this month we're talking about Ridley Scott's Gladiator II, as well as Scott's celebrated original film from the year 2000. This episode also marks 4 years of the podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you're new to the podcast and like what you're hearing, please remember to subscribe, rate, and review. And now on to the show.
And here we go.
Are you not entertained? Russell Crowe's General Maximus roared this at the watching crowds in the original Gladiator, the blockbuster epic that reignited our fascination with Rome while winning the Oscar for Best Picture and Best Actor. There was desire for a sequel in the years that followed, including a baffling script by Nick Cave that saw Maximus return from the dead in order to do battle with Christians in the name of Roman gods and eventually be cursed to live and do battle forever, surviving to fight through World War II and the Vietnam War before getting a job at the modern-day Pentagon. Seriously. But they never cracked it until this year, when Scott returned to the well with the sequel that follows Paul Mescal's Lucius, now a grown man 16 years after the first film, and enslaved to do battle in the Colosseum, like Maximus before him. The tagline of Gladiator II is, "You will be entertained." In the original film, the line was a condemnation. Now the line seems to be a promotion. Is it because we're the Roman spectators, howling for blood as the empire crumbles around us? Or is such a reading too generous for a film that seems to be more focused on spectacle and entertainment than the original film, which also was a moral portrait of a good man?
Okay, Ramblers, let's get rambling.
Anton, you already published a review of Gladiator 2 on the website, so we know that you liked the film, even if you admit that it doesn't match the heights of the first one. So I'll ask you, Anders, what did you think of Ridley Scott's belated follow-up to his sword and sandal classic?
I think it's actually a great piece of pop art. It's, I think, it's very entertaining. So, yeah, I think the tagline is accurate. We can, even if we want to unpack what exactly the film's saying about all that. But no, I liked it quite a bit, even though I would agree with Anton that it doesn't quite reach the heights that the first one sort of did upon first watch back then. And we can get into the original, obviously, later in the podcast. I don't think the sequel is so far apart from it, though. I do think that both films, in some sense, are more interested in giving us a good entertainment and a good story than they are, giving us an accurate picture of the Roman Empire. In some ways, they almost remind me of it's kind of appropriate that we have this legacy sequel to Gladiator, because I think partly through the characterization of especially Maximus and even some of the other supporting characters, it creates a rich enough world that you kind of felt that there's more to it, like a Star Wars or maybe a Godfather. That's the it's expansive and it provides a sort of imaginative world to inhabit in a really good way. So that's my sort of first take on it.
Yeah. So it sounds like we're all kind of on the same page that it's an entertaining movie. It's a pretty good action epic.
It's great action in it.
But it's not the original. And I know I'm the minority of the three of us that I really like Gladiator, but it's not my favorite of the Ridley Scott movies of that era. I like Kingdom of Heaven more.
Is it a top 5 Ridley Scott for you?
I think it probably is. Yeah, I think it is. Because what would
sure.
be Blade Runner, Alien, Kingdom of Heaven, Gladiator, probably, and then I'm trying to think of what's the other great Ridley Scott. There are several I really like Thelma and Louise.
Prometheus.
I like Prometheus. I wouldn't put it quite up there. Yeah. I would need to revisit something like Black Rain, which has actually lingered in my brain so much since seeing it. Purely almost for style. I've never seen The Duelists, which I know a lot of people praise heavily. But so I think we're all kind of on board that we're pretty much in the can for late Ridley Scott, even if we differ somewhat on how good his late output is, but we like Alien Covenant. I know, Anders, you and me, we like Alien Covenant a lot. We like Prometheus a lot.
I think he's far from washed
I like
up.
The Counselor. I'm one of those people.
Yeah, Counselor is really good. I actually found a Blu-ray of it in one of those little libraries the other day,
Nice.
unwatched, I think. So it's like the Hemingway story, Counselor DVD, never used or whatever. I could make a vulgar joke about the car, but in the movie, I'm not going to. No, but so I kind of to start this off, something that you didn't touch on in your review, Anton, and I would think it might be an interesting thing for us to talk about because it's a topic we always seem to pick up on because it's a Hollywood fixation. And it's this movie as a legacy sequel.
Yeah.
How exactly do you think this movie works as a legacy sequel in that it is something that is continuing the story of the original, but actually also works as a kind of diegetic reboot of the original film following the same overall arc for a person who'd never seen the original?
So I think it exhibits the most common features of the legacy sequel, which I think is this anxious self-reflexivity that a legacy sequel not only wants to continue the storyline, but is like anxious about its own continuation of the storyline because it's aware that there's a crass commercialism to doing this, but at the same time it wants to do it, but then it also they often then allows for a kind of like metatextual commentary on film itself. And I feel like going all the way back to 2015, the year of Jurassic World and The Force Awakens, which really starts this idea of like legacy sequels or requels or diegetic reboots where you're trying to continue a story, but also kind of reignite a franchise commodity. They all exhibit these features. And it's interesting because in a movie like this, it brings back, it has the callbacks and brings back certain characters and recalls certain scenes. But what's interesting is it doesn't bring back its central figure because it can't.
Yes.
Because Russell Crowe, is Maximus is dead. And,
Unless you're
as you
going to do
mentioned,
something crazy like Nick Cave did.
yes, as you mentioned, like, people were toying around with how you potentially could because he's such a good character. But at the same time, Russell Crowe's Maximus lingers around all the edges of this film, and he looms so large that he's almost a Star Wars Force ghost in this film.
Yeah, he haunts it.
I'm just imagining him like standing in a field like maybe like Kevin Costner in Man of Steel with the grain.
Yeah.
Like it's like, Lucius, it's like I'm rooting for you.
But I guess the extra way that the meta aspect then works is that the original Gladiator already had an interest in itself.
Yes.
As spectacle entertainment for the masses.
Yes, and it's
so
also interested in the idea of like celebrity and how you win crowd. So there is already
But do you think that this movie then? I think this movie even has perhaps a stronger interest.
Yes.
In those metatextual aspects, the theatrical aspects of the Gladiator match.
Yes.
In the Colosseum.
I think even more than that. I think that this film, it plays off the original in multiple ways. Maybe I'm talking myself into actually thinking Gladiator 2 is even better than I thought in certain ways, in interesting ways. It's an interesting film, and it's one that actually is more than just spectacle, even though if it is spectacle, it's not like an art film. Is that the original already had this like sort of challenge to the notion of Rome becoming this brutal place where people are, they have gladiator fights and they're conquering, empires and things like that, with Marcus Aurelius's, The Dream of Rome, which gets then referenced multiple times in this, the sequel as well, right?
There was once a dream that was Rome. You could only whisper it. Anything more than a whisper, and it would vanish. It was so fragile. And I fear that it will not survive the winter.
And then by the time you get to the new one, you have, Pedro Pascal's Acacius is like, questioning battle. And, as other people have said this, but it's not just because he's like tired and wants to go home with his family like Maximus. It's like he's like, why am I doing this? I'm just like he questions like whether it's worthwhile doing, especially for the vile emperors, right?
Yeah, he's lost belief in the purpose of the conquest.
And then you have the very most strange thing is that this sort of hidden child of, because rewatching the original, I'm like, it's maybe kind of hinted at, but never explicitly confirmed in the original that Lucius is Maximus's son, right?
Yeah, I think it was always just sort of a fan speculation.
Yeah. It's a bit of a retcon, you might even say.
Maybe. I would
but
say
it's consistent. They don't have to like fudge things.
Rewatching it this time around with this knowledge, it altered how I understood certain scenes.
But don't you think that it's a little bit like Obi-Wan Kenobi's from a certain point of view? Like they didn't
Yes.
know when they wrote it. Yeah. Okay. That's what I mean. Yeah. Lucius Hanno is like actually like anti the Empire at first, right?
Yes.
Like he's like, Rome is horrible. They killed my wife. They should be destroyed. And then so it introduces this ambivalence about the very state of Rome back into it, which I think you could metatextually also read as a ambivalence about doing a sequel in some way.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like why are we doing this? Like,
so questioning Rome becomes also a questioning of like the purpose of
yeah.
of a
Now I
movie
think
like
it
this.
can be read on a lot of. I think I am making a reading of the film there. I don't think it's intended in that way. I think it's also very obvious, just like in the first one. The concerns of this movie are contemporary concerns, contemporary political questions.
Yeah,
but
for sure.
Like a science fiction film.
They even mentioned the Roman dream multiple times in the script.
Just like a science fiction or fantasy world allows you to explore broad concepts on a canvas. Like, and that's how Ridley Scott treats it, rather than like actually analyzing how did the twin emperors, of sons of whatever Severus, like actually like rule and things. It's using it as actually to question our own world today because of the obvious parallels that you've noted between, like on our last podcast, you said in the show Rome allows us to sort of consider about the role of empires and republics and things. Yeah.
So, okay, before we get into more about, say, the politics or more about other aspects, Aaron, where do you stand on its status as a legacy sequel and any potential meta aspects of it?
I think the reverence of Maximus and the idol, like the fact that they make him almost like God within the film, where there's the literal
he's a saint,
tomb.
at the least.
Yeah, but where his
pagan saint. Yeah.
Oh, you're right. He becomes a mystery cult figure.
Yes.
Yeah.
For the gladiators down in the catacombs.
Yeah, because they have his armor.
His armor's there, but nobody dares touch it. The idea of it's waiting for somebody to take up its mantle, and it's almost this lost promise of, it creates an almost like sacred redemptive aspect to it, where the idea of like you can restore Rome only if you take up the literal mantle of Maximus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and then like his ghost or whatever, like it's this idea of like the spirit of Maximus that becomes incarnate and he wears it, but only the worthy man can wear it, thus only his son can wear it.
So Maximus becomes a mystery called God.
But then potentially becomes a Caesar figure because the mantle has to be passed on,
because then in Caesar is divinity incarnate for the Romans.
And that's the one of the interesting things I just think is that like they're already talking about Gladiator 3, right? And is that going to be but is Gladiator like the end of this movie is a much more like it's a happy ending and it's a more clear-cut victory than the original film, but it also leaves open this question of like, is the only way for Rome to be restored with Lucius becoming some kind of restorer emperor? Like, the character, he takes up his mantle as like, I'm the Prince of Rome. I've returned to restore it to glory kind of thing. And he's almost like shedding he's shedding the name of Hanno, right? But he's also seems to be shedding any sense of like personal interest anymore. And he gives himself up, which is where it comes in with that. He takes then back his original name. And it's very much like, again, like the King David or King Arthur kind of thing of like the lost prince has come back to reclaim his throne, right?
Yeah, and that's how you.
So it puts that aspect into the movie, but it adds this whole layer of the Ridley Scott approach of like he can never be satisfied with a clear veneration of like pure power or things like that. He always has to have some kind of subtle undercut because he's very skeptical of things. Ridley Scott's one of those guys. He's skeptical of power, religion, legend. He's very much a postmodern filmmaker in that sense because he doesn't actually believe in like the power myths. He thinks they're things that control people as opposed to things to like, he thinks truth, right? Reality, reason, that's the liberative quality. And so Ridley Scott would align himself much more with Marcus Aurelius.
Yes.
And this idea of the Roman Republic, the Stoicism, the idea that Rome is an idea that has to be fulfilled through the like veneration of this concept through the act of democracy, right? And the end of this movie, it kind of promises a restoration of the Senate, but not really. Like, not entirely. It seems to be almost like a compromised vision of we will return to a early republic empire that is more of it's less degenerative. And so when, extra textual wise, when Ridley Scott is talking about this movie is a commentary somewhat on modern politics. Maybe we'll move into the politics stuff here. And the fact that it's very much a like make Rome great again ending.
Mm-hmm.
I can't see Ridley Scott not thinking that there's something dark to that ending that is lingering.
Here's two comments. One, like I totally agree about Ridley Scott's skeptical view in his films and his unwillingness to sort of embrace a myth or any sort of authority without sort of questioning it in some level. But I also think that plays into Ridley Scott. How is that realized in his films? He's a very tactile, visual, world building filmmaker. And so what that means is that almost all Ridley Scott movies, even not just Blade Runner and Alien, but almost all of his movies present the world as a dystopia. Yeah. I made this argument in my argument
in Black
Rain, but I think it's the same thing about its vision of Rome in this film. Where it's so like the corruption is so magnified that it takes on like those dystopian qualities.
It's a decadent empire in collapse, right? Like literally collapsing in and of itself.
But then it's held up as this idea of like, well, how might you usher in a utopia? And I think what it's wrestling with, and what it recognizes, that Rome always, and why it eventually became an empire, always wrestled with the idea of how do you deal with corruption, or how do you deal with external threats? The only way we can deal with that is by surrendering power in limited form to a dictator. And eventually the dictator just became the emperor and solidified that power. But before even Caesar, people had become dictators, and the Senate would give them that power to deal with that exttional threat internal thing.
Referenced in The Dark Knight when Harvey Dent says the people of Rome had to, gave over power. The Senate, the people gave over the power to one man who would act essentially outside the law in order to maintain, but he has to be the good man and like relinquish it lest you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
That's why the only one who can fulfill it is Maximus, who dies then.
Yes. And that's a great connection point with The Dark Knight then, where again these sort of dictator type figures, whether they're Maximus, Batman, the only way they maintain their sort of righteousness in our view is actually through like self-sacrifice, right? Like
because if you don't,
Batman has to become hunted at the end of the movie. And
this is what people who've accused both those films of having like sort of latent fascist appeal. They miss that. That's the key. Is that the person who does that has it to sort of die.
So it leaves this movie with an interesting, if they are going to make a third, the question is, are they then going to take a dark route and you have Lucius become someone, someone tyrannical, essentially? Because then that's the other thing, is Rome's always struggling with the tyrant. And that's, its founding as a republic is because through tyrannicide, through killing the tyrant king. But like, so there's always this tension in the Roman history. But then that's partly why when people talk about these movies as history and they're not great history and stuff, you're like, that's why I think Gladiator works really well as kind of Shakespeare style Roman history, where it's like, let's take these like characters and now I'm going to make a movie that's telling you something about power and about other stuff, but we're going to fudge some of the details.
So I just want to take this opportunity to shout out Tides of History podcast, Patrick Wyman, who also wrote The Verge, really great book, sort of pop history book. He wrote a positive review of Gladiator II, where he basically makes that same argument, that he's like, people who are accusing these films of having bad history are not wrong, but they're also missing the point.
Yeah.
But two, that he says that it's not just that it's all silly, like we can get into how the heck do you even get sharks into the Colosseum logistically, but more but he says he's common pronounce. It's like Gladiator 2 gets the vibe of Rome right. It understands the feel, and like even if the details are often silly or wrong, and obviously transposing things from now, it actually offers some insight into the character and quality of Rome in a way that it actually is sort of historical. So it's an interesting argument he's making. He says, but I kind of agree with him.
So okay, but this also gives an interesting bridge into the idea of like, so talking about some of the potential, plot or historical holes, but then feeding into some of the themes. One thing I pointed out is like my wife and I saw this, and she was afterwards was like, yeah, like did they even like, could you fill up the Colosseum? And I was like, my understanding, and again, I'm not a historian of ancient Rome, but my understanding is that from books I've looked at is that they did.
Mm-hmm. They did do moxie battles at least once.
Yeah, and it's like, well, how would you go about doing that? How would you get sharks or things like that? Now, my comment to her was
how do you transport a shark in a world without glass? I don't, and like
but my comment to her was that, okay, like I understand that there's a lot of like plausibility we might get flags, but we also forget that you're like, this is a world, and the movie makes very clear this is a world when you have such low regard for human life. And if you're willing to spend as many lives possible to make something happen, there's a lot of things you can do.
That's exactly
you could literally just march everybody with a bucket from the coast with salt water if you really wanted to, because they don't care about people.
Well,
and that's thematically a key part of the movie.
You build an aqueduct for the water, but that's exactly what Patrick Wyman says. He's like, having the sharks. The whole point is that it shows how like insanely. Get over the idea of how bloodthirsty and crazy they were, and the depravity they were willing to like put on display.
So this then gives an opportunity to address, I think, one of the most important features of Gladiator II, thus unmentioned so far in this podcast. Maximus. Denzel Washington's Maximus. Because I think one of the great things about this movie is that in creating the Lucius character as this, I guess, ambivalent figure, determining whether he's going to embrace Rome, he's coming from hating it, embrace his destiny. I think we are set up with a second figure who does complicate the story, but thematically is very rich. And Maximus is someone who's like, to me, he's great because he's just like, here's a character who just cuts to the chase and says, okay, I care about nothing but power. And in my definition of power can be best equated actually with brute force and violence. How do I literally, and there's even lines where he talks about, I'm going to enforce my will upon you, Lucius.
You will be my instrument.
And that's his goal. And he's the kind of person who's like, you admire him a bit because he's not painting over his goals with any sort of false virtue.
There's no niceties or anything.
Yeah, but that's the heart of Rome, a world where you're like, I literally, if you're my slave, I can do anything I want with you. I can kill you. If that's the rules of the game, he's going to try and play it to the.
And I think it's very interesting because you also have these figures, Ravi and Maximus, who both describe they were both once enslaved under Rome, and they have become freed. And so there's that's part of the dream of Rome. Like, where, as Ravi says, where else in the world can a guy who obviously was taken from like, Persia or, the Far East.
He's the doctor figure.
Isn't he from Varanasi? That's what he says.
So India.
I think, isn't he Indian?
Yeah. Okay. So India. I didn't know how far away. I forget.
I just thought I picked up on a line about that.
And then he could, of course, move to Britain and marry a British woman.
He's a great.
But he says, why didn't you go home? Yes, why didn't you go home? Because only in Rome could this happen, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But Maximus is the same thing. Only in Rome, And then Lucius questions him about like why are you doing it? And he's like, he quotes the Cicero that and the great Denzel says it so well. It's like Cicero said that the enslaved don't want to destroy slavery. They simply want slaves of their own, and that's like that idea that like people don't want freedom. People want power.
I thought his casting also has like extra significance because, so he played right in American Gangster with Ridley Scott. And if I think of things like Training Day, so it also, he's someone who like, when we talk about, if you ever watch The Wire, right, there's The Game, which is like kind of the rules of the street and the drug dealing. But it's like, and it's similar in the sense of like, if you're going to sort of set up a ruthless sort of game and there'd be characters who just like, how do I play it to win it? That's what he's doing. And that's why
you can buy Denzel Washington in that role because he comes across as always the smartest guy in the room.
And that's why I can see people describing him as being kind of like, he's almost this gangster figure in Rome. because again, you're like, he's sort of a slave master or a gladiator trainer,
master.
but it's hard to tell, like,
But he's also got political ambitions, and
Yeah.
he's always hanging around the court.
And he sells stuff, like he clearly sells things to like the army.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
has
he's a
those
weapons
connections.
dealer
weapons
too, right?
dealer too. Yeah.
Yeah.
But so like on the modern political lens, Macrinus is the self-made man, right? He is the Trumpian figure,
Yes.
if there is one in this.
No, absolutely,
right?
because he's also, as Antoine said, he strips away the niceties. He's brute.
He
lays
shows you what
bare,
Rome
lays
really
bare
is.
the lies the nation tells itself about how all their leaders are.
But he's also admirable to a lot of people because he is honest about that.
Yep.
The thing that I was reminded of is we don't get a lot of it in the movies except for in Tragedy and Macbeth, but Denzel is an accomplished Shakespearean actor known for playing Iago.
Yeah.
And Othello and stuff. So like there's elements of that in this character where he's almost like Othello and Iago put into like one individual.
The way he manipulates the emperors is like...
I love the scene where he like lays out his plan of how he's going to take power, where it's like he's just going to create like a political like enemy, like he is going to show the brutality of the emperors, and then at the moment when the crowds turn, he'll just kill the emperors and show that he's overcome their like evil, and then he'll be like the chosen one.
He is almost also the Emperor Palpatine in this.
He's really enjoyable, and the training day thing is important. The training day connection is important as well because it's, despite Lucius being not a naive character at all, right?
Yeah. That's important.
He's aware of Rome. He's a talented fighter. He's very jaded.
Yeah.
So things don't surprise him at any turn. But he
rage.
is willing
He's
to
got
be
rage.
surprised.
That's his secret weapon.
But Macrinus, there's an ambivalent relationship between the two of them to start, and it grows into like a genuine antagonism, right, over the course of the film, where the ending actually reveals Macrinus as the true villain, right? Like you see it slowly unfurls where you assume it's going to be like Pedro Pascal, but he's actually an honorable man, and then you think it's going to be the emperors, and the emperors are evil, but they're also
kind of pathetic
monsters,
and decadent,
they're like fools, right, in a sense, and
but
it's
literally
like
the one guy's like a syphilitic like fool.
Yeah, he's been driven mad. Yeah,
Macrinus is the one with an actual plan who that plan requires the like subjugation and destruction of Lucius as a body, as like a figure, to make that plan come to term. But then also it's got that training day element where he's bad news, but because he's played by Denzel, you admire him. Yeah. And so you're almost blind to the fact that like, oh, he's been doing all this the whole time.
Yeah.
His plan has unfurled, and it's like, wait, you didn't realize this was the plan? Like, it's the scene in Train Day where he gives him the drugs, and it's like, you're high right now.
A Los Angeles Police Department narcotics officer was killed today, serving a high-risk warrant in Echo Park. Give me the bitch. LAPD spokesperson said the officer is survived by his wife and infant child. Shit gets deeper. You get the picture.
The whole where you realize that from the first moment you met him that he's like never been a good guy.
You're making me want to watch Training Day. Yeah.
Training Day is a really good movie. People,
especially for the performances, are really good.
Yeah, it's the Macrinus. Like,
is that also 2000?
2001, I think, next year.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because he lost to he
lost
won
to Crowe.
against.
Oh, you're right. He won, so he couldn't have been 2000.
Exactly. He beat Crowe. No, sorry, he lost to
99.
No, he beat Crowe in 2001. Russell Crowe's in Beautiful Mind. Yeah,
he beat him for Beautiful Mind, but Crowe had won for
Gladiator. Yeah. So Denzel is so he's just such an enjoable actor when he's on really too, and it's.
The one last thing I'll say about his relationship with Lucius is, you said it's ambivalent, and then it becomes this antagonism. You could almost imagine a version of the story though where it goes the other way, and Lucius works for him. Yeah.
No, but that's the thing, is that if he wields his rage like in a more, if Lucius gives himself over to it more, you can understand that he uses Macrinus as a tool of vengeance, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's also why, like, genre-wise, thinking of gangster movies actually informs how we like understand this movie, because that sort of arc of like, you have this this figure on the margins who has a lot of potential, and he's brought into the world through this mentor. Like this is like a form that's in all sorts of sort of crime and gangster movies.
The other element of that Macrinus and like Denzel's performance I think is really important is clarifying like the relationship to Paul Mescal's Lucius, right? And Paul Mescal does not play Lucius like just Maximus 2.0. Like it's almost like an understated performance in elements. He's very reserved and he's very stoic throughout this
because
film.
he's the grandson of Marcus Aurelius.
But it's just interesting because the movie doesn't really position it as like this is the Paul Mescal star turn. In its promotions and even just the way it builds the plot and the way that the movie adores certain characters, Denzel's Maximus and then Pedro Pascal's General are kind of the more elevated figures within the like world of the plot.
And they're both big stars.
Yeah, and they're big stars. It's the ones that
and
the
those
movie,
are star
like,
making.
leverages.
Those are star rules.
Yeah.
So, but just to clarify, so what you mean by the difference between Paul Mescal and Russell Crowe's performance is essentially a lack of or a muted charisma?
Yeah, I like Paul Mescal as an actor. I think he
and
fits
this is not a knock
well
on the
here.
performance.
No,
actually.
but he's Lucius.
But he doesn't play to the crowd the same.
Exactly.
No, he actually is contemptuous of the crowd.
Maximus is contemptuous of the crowd in a sense too, but he understands that the crowd's on his side, and Lucius doesn't because they're Romans, and he doesn't care about them.
But like, you know, Maximus is always a charismatic figure in that he draws the admiration of those around him, and he knows how to orchestrate. It's the way he walks around and shakes hands with like his regular soldiers before
I'll talk about this more when we talk about Gladiator, but Maximus is like, he's like the good coach. He goes around to the guys before the game, fist bump. All right, man, you feeling ready? You ready? All right, here we're going to go, but Lucius is not that.
He does it at times, but he doesn't have the same, it doesn't operate the same way.
He's admirable through his skill mostly. Like he's just really good at fighting. I will say that in terms of a plot construction and motivational aspects, I think the biggest weakness of this film is that it relies too much on you assuming that, like, knowing that he's Lucius and that he's the son
from
and
the
the
first
grandson.
scene, even though it's technically not revealed.
Right. Even after it's revealed, let's assume it's a surprise. I think the other thing, and the reason I wonder if there's a longer cut of the film that would make more sense, is that I found Lucius's turn, if you want to call it that, his switch from agreeing, wanting to tear down Rome and burn it to the ground and hating everything about it, to being, okay, no, I'm going to use this. I'm going to rally my guys and stuff, and agree to take command of, Acacius's army.
So how do you see
there's a gap there to me.
How do you see it pivoting? Because when I watch the movie, I think it all hinges on bringing in another legacy character. It's Connie Nielsen's Lucille.
Yeah, but they needed to then make their first meeting more like, they set up the first meeting as him rejecting her, but they don't really do more with it. And then
how we go from his strong overreaction of like, I don't like you, to being like, you know what, actually I love you, Mom, and I want to do
it's that. Kind of just because the plot requires it.
A little bit. I agree that it does feel truncated, and I agree that like I don't think Lucius's arc has the clarity that I would love.
Exactly.
Well, I also think as a legacy sequel, it's the movie stumbles a bit by making its central new-ish character also a character from the old movie who's just grown up. Like, if this, one of the strengths I think of something like Force Awakens, which I know a lot of people have soured on over the years, but a character like Rey is a unknown. Therefore,
until
no, I know
the third movie, and then it kind of does this.
But what third movie?
It connects. No, but it connects. But Rey's not in the old movies, right? At all. And come on, remember the lessons from Scream 5, right? Like a requel is all about, you have to have new characters so that when you eliminate the old characters, you still have the audience investment. You can keep telling your story. So the idea is that you are convincing people to follow the new character stories by using the old characters as bait.
So the new character is it's Maximus.
No, it is,
and he's heavy in the marketing too.
But I'm saying is that Lucius
is the biggest star.
Is not actually, he doesn't actually fulfill that true like legacy sequel
because he's not. It'd be like Yeah.
But it means that the movie shortchanges his character development. It assumes familiarity so that it doesn't give you enough breathing room with him and his wife. It just assumes, well, it's a wife, revenge, blah. Like, next, let's move on.
Yeah.
And this is my biggest issue with the movie, is that I think it hits certain beats in like a perfunctory manner, in the sense that I can kind of tell that Ridley's like, I got a longer cut, but let's just do this theatrical cut and I'll fiddle later. And I'll refine it later.
But don't you think it also, though, ultimately, because it is, though, it has a lot of interesting things going on, and great performances, and I want to talk about like the action and things too. But ultimately, it is also kind of like because it's sort of popular art. It's kind of sentimental, and so it doesn't feel it needs to pitch those kind of things. It's like, that's just what happens in these kind of things, and you buy it, and you're like gonna.
I get it on that level, but I agree with Aaron that there is sort of it's like the movie doesn't know that if we're gonna have Lucius, but he's gonna be under an alias at the start.
Why not play it as a surprise?
You could better play this as a true surprise that's revealed, or you could go a different route and bring in a character who isn't attached, and they kind of try and do both, and it kind of. That's why it has a bit of like a muddled, fudged feel to. In
a lot of ways, it feels like they're jamming two things together that don't really quite.
Yeah, no, I can see that, and I think that sort of is probably one of the main reasons why I feel the movie just, when you're thinking of it as in comparison to the original, like the original has just such a clear, perfect narrative arc, and then this movie. It gets moments of that, but overall, it just feels a little bit more back and forth. It's not nearly as muddled. I'll give Scarpa credit that it's not nearly as muddled as like Napoleon, right? Which Scarpa also wrote for Ridley Scott, but it definitely like that. It's one of the major deficiencies. If I was like, if someone was like, well, why isn't this like a great, just like one of the years better? Because it's super entertaining. The action's great, and we have to dissect it.
I'm going to go and say this. I think that there are times when, that's the movie's biggest divergence from the original, is its lack of the character of Maximus and this sort of clear story propulsion that seems so essential and it just works so well.
Because
right?
Gladiator, if someone's like, it's a revenge plot, and then that explains what it's doing.
But I'm just saying, like, I think that's the main way that I think a lot of people are seeing this as way inferior. I'm like, no, I think that's the main difference. And so why it doesn't quite resonate as deeply. I think on a lot of other ways, it's actually very similar to the original in terms of its use of spectacle, its use of CGI to create its world. Both films occasionally lapse into almost like goofiness, like not goofy, but like heightened sense of things, right? Like they're not strictly realistic.
Well, so for example, and then what?
Like the new one is especially.
What would be an example in the old one or the new one?
In the old
what you
one,
mean by that?
I think like there's a literalness to like Ridley Scott's like kind of way of doing things. Like there's just the scenes like it wants to remind it that Commodus is going to do. He's giving them bread in circuses and like literally throwing bread out to people and things like that. And it has like like. Maximus, one thing I actually love about the movie is that Maximus is not so ripped by modern standards. He's like kind of a normal guy.
Well, same thing with Lucius Paul Mescal in this movie is that he looks like
don't have like roided up.
He looks like Charlton Heston strong, right? Like where you're like.
Although I would actually go so far as to say that Heston was more cut and Ben-Hur even than either of these guys, but. Yeah, like
I'm just glad they don't have like Marvel bod because that's
exactly.
not believable.
Please, I know. I think that's actually something that we can praise about these films. I mean, the second one is much more over the top. The second one is much more over the top. I will definitely admit, but the first one has like it plays for maximum like kind of like heightened emotions and stuff like that, right? Like Commodus is like comically almost evil, like suffocating his dad with a pillow and things like that. You know, like.
Gladiator is also a swashbuckler.
It's almost melodramatic too, like
right. It's an adventure movie.
Yeah,
like I think it owes a lot to like things like The Adventures of Robin Hood too.
Yeah, exactly.
And so
those are good comps. Those are good comps. Yeah.
But so let's talk about one thing I like about this movie that follows, and you sort of mentioned it, follows the structure of the original, is like it's very purposeful in how it sort of sets up its action scenes.
Yes.
And in a world where like, I'll go see certain action movies especially sort of Marvel type action. And there, we can extend that outwards, but like
Yeah.
where you kind of see the movie and you're like, okay, there was like a whole bunch of stuff happening, but
Blur
nothing really.
of, like-
It's all sort of blurred. I don't really know like what the purpose of that action scene was. I don't really understand the geography of the action scene. I don't really understand the goal of that action scene. Whereas
Ridley
here,
Scott
it's like,
shoots amazing action on big scale.
But it's also like, it's not fully like when you watch the original Gladiator, when you watch this movie, it's not wall to wall action.
No.
But it's methodical. It's like, okay, we're going to have our opening battle, which is going to be a large scale battle between armies. And then we're going to have, I think, like, this movie has, by my count, like 4
key
matches.
Coliseum matches, yeah.
And one's on the outskirts, and then 3 are in the actual Coliseum. But each of those then becomes its own little wonderful like world of geography and stakes and rise and fall and all those sorts of things from the amazing, like, I mean, like the baboons are, I have my quibbles about the CGI, but it still was creepy.
It's also hilarious. I think the guy next to me was like looking at me weird because I was like almost doing a Max Caddy, like cackling in the front row about, by the way, almost full movie theater, only 2 empty seats when I saw it.
So I thought the baboon fight was like pretty enjoyable, even though it's pretty ridiculous.
Absolutely.
And him biting the baboon is like definitely just trying to sort of show the like kind of like, that this movie is going to sort of go a next step in sort of it's crazy in the action scenes. The rhino fight was cool. And tricking it to smash its horn.
Also, how do you train a guy to ride a rhino?
One day at a time.
One guy at a time.
Yeah, exactly. You don't want to know how many people they lost.
Then the sharks.
Then the galley with the sharks, and then the final fight where it's like just defense. That again, like the original, the final one then becomes it's not trying to outdo in the spectacle. It becomes actually more, much more limited in terms of the spectacle, but then it has like an emotional and aspect because now here he has to defend his mother, and so it becomes sort of like smaller stakes, more personal.
But you're also missing when they force him to fight Pedro Pascal.
Isn't that the same time when right before his mother's brought out on the thing?
Isn't his mother the final fight?
Maybe there's one more.
I think are those two at the same time though? No, they're not. Okay.
I'm not sure.
Kind of blurs together. I think.
Oh yeah, there might be 5. There might be the Pedro.
And then also the fight just in the palace in front of the 2 emperors when Maximus is like, fight this guy.
Yeah, it's a different fight.
Oh, okay.
So there's the other fight of him fighting General Cassius, and it's, remember, like he throws the sword away and then he's trying to defend him, but the emperors will have none of it and force the execution with the arrows, going Boromir style.
Yeah, it is a very Boromir scene,
and that maybe doesn't count. It's not a scene of spectacle, right? It's a 2 characters facing off against each other. It's the thing that you've been built up, but it's deliberately said as like a dramatic undercutting.
Mm-hmm.
So he says this is what he wants. It's not actually what he wants. He sees it's breaking his mother's heart. He sees that the emperors and Maximus are gaining something immeasurably out of it, and that Acacius is actually the type of man who represents the Rome of his father, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And you get these things where Acacius is like, oh, I knew Maximus. I fought with him. And it's, again, even the Roman characters have these like veneration of Maximus.
Actually, that's a good point though about Acacius, is that I think Lucius's relationship to him is also one where he realizes that Maximus also would have killed people and conquered lands in the same way that he resents Acacius doing so in Numidia.
Yeah, because Macrinus even mentions, doesn't he mention knowing Maximus as well? Or at least Romans, like he's
seen him fight.
Something about that, yeah.
Yeah, I think he says I saw him.
He saw one of the fights. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, one of the Gladiator matches.
The action in the movie is refreshing purely on that maybe Ridley Scott is good at it. I actually don't think there's no scene in this movie that had my blood like pumping quite like the original of the tiger fight.
Against Tigris Segal.
Yeah, it's so good. It's like that fight's just insane, and it's so intense. And because it's something that I agree that you should not have nowadays, but like the fact that it's real tigers, in elements of the shots makes you feel like, oh, holy crap. There's no real rhino here. And again, I'm not for them going and getting a rhino and putting it on film.
Or cutting its head off and serving it on a platter like the one in another scene.
Oh, yeah.
wouldn't
Where
have
he's
to
just
kill
shaving
it.
the horn.
You know, I just wanted to say something about the action.
Are they doing lines of ivory? Is that what's going on?
I guess
No,
so. Remember,
no.
Anton, it's a aphrodisiac.
Yeah, it's aphrodisiac.
Oh, okay.
It's
like
an orgy.
rhino horn, historically, that's what people kill them for.
Gotcha.
Still.
It's an orgy.
Unfortunately. No, it's-
But there's something with the visual style of this film that the original is interesting because it was an early digital CGI film, right? Like it was one of the first bigger Oscar films, at least, to like have substantial scenes of that. I actually rewatching it now in like HD, or like, oh, some of the stuff's a bit rough in the original Gladiator, which kind of gives it a charm. Like it's not like 100% perfectly polished. Some of the composite, like not just the compositing, but also the color timing is weird in a couple of scenes.
Some of the CGI reminds you a bit of like when you're watching older Star Trek, like DS9 or something, and it's like now we're showing a location scene that's all CGI, and you can sort of tell it is.
Yeah.
It's the exterior shots of Rome, right?
Yeah,
They're a little bit.
They look video game-ish.
Yeah. Civilization.
Or like nowadays, I'd say like Assassin's Creed looking kind of. So there's that, right? But that's kind of charming, and there's still a physicality to a lot of the stuff, right? But the new one, like was my one comment was there are moments in this movie that it almost feels like those weird AI generated like images come to life. Do you agree at all?
Like what?
So like first, like the scale of things is on like such a bizarre level at times. Like even the ships that they use to invade Numidia with the giant towers, like just seem really, really big. And then you have like the shots of the Colosseum in Rome and stuff. It looms even larger, and the streets are just so full of people, and it seems to go so far deep into the background. You're like, I've seen these kind of like strange, and like even the party scenes with stuff on the tables and stuff. There's something, it's spectacle, but it almost comes across as like AI, those like strange, uncanny AI images at times.
I feel like this movie really kind of just like takes advantage of sort of advances in technology to kind of go all out on like, we're going to give you like very elaborate vistas of Rome,
but it almost becomes science fictional. Like some things, like the Colosseum seems almost impossibly big.
I don't know if I didn't notice the scale thing as much. I did notice sort of like, you know, if you're comparing them, the original Gladiator looks a little bit more like TV, where you're trying to like.
Well, it was shot on location, like.
But what I mean is like where you're trying to like hide the fact that you don't want to show everything and limit your set by how you shoot it. But at the same time, I'd also say that the original Gladiator versus this, what I really noticed was that Ridley Scott has somewhat, not entirely, but a little bit more stepped away from his like visual like atmospherics, to the extent that like if you go back to Gladiator, almost every scene is like almost heavily tinted. I mean, I think a lot of it wasn't post-production tinted, but a lot of it is through like cinematography and stuff. But like, so it's like this scene this is like a red flame fire scene, and then everything is like that, and then this is going to be sort of a blue, you know, sort of white light scene, and then this is going to be, you know, and if you watch Gladiator again, it's very intense and striking the way like the light is used. And Kingdom of Heaven does that a lot too. But this, like Napoleon, they do that at times. Like I can still see the Ridley Scott, but it's not as strong. And you don't get the, like in the action scenes, you don't get the same like Saving Private Ryan style.
Yeah, there is a elaborateness to Napoleon and Gladiator II, like is what I'm saying. Like the scale of shots is uncanny at times. Like the shots of Napoleon firing the cannons at the pyramids and stuff like that. Yeah. Again, also sort of pseudo historical. Like this is the reason I want to say this film is almost like an AI image of history, is that like these are almost like hallucinations that it's like getting wrong. Like no, Napoleon never shot that, but it kind of feels like maybe he did, you know? Or like we have a Roman senator who's going to sit down at a cafe and read a newspaper. Wait, there were no newspapers in ancient Rome. What the? Like, it's just sort of like a strange, heightened, weird version of it. But you're right. The original has that interesting color time. I think that's actually also, he was being very influenced by his like brother Tony at that time. I think it's still in that phase.
Oh yeah. Some of those Tony Scott movies too are intense.
The original has more of a Tony shot look. This new one has that like ultra, like crisp feel that like everything since Prometheus has kind of had. Aaron, I don't know. What do you think of the CGI and special effects and stuff?
They're good. It is one of those things that I appreciate about new Star Wars movies or Dune or, like it's just seamless CGI. And I feel like we're at the point where if you're throwing 200 million at a movie, you almost have no excuse for something like the baboons.
But you can't
looking the way they do. Because I'm like, you did Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. You can have guys looking dead on like an ape. You could just
you can't interact that with the humans.
CGI
Can you?
Why not?
How did he wrestle with Gollum? Like,
I know, but to me, like the baboons feel like Gollum wrestling Gollum. Like they're like, what I mean is like I buy it enough, but I still don't believe it's real.
Yeah, it's not breaking. It's not breaking the movie or anything. I do think movie. It's a whole economic thing that you could go into. It's just CGI's not quite as good as it is on the top movies because they just don't want to pay as much.
I agree. I just think like I just feel like CGI animals. Like I can't remember the last time I saw a CGI animal that actually looked real. To be honest,
Life of Pi.
I didn't actually see the movie.
Oh, it's great.
I should.
Oh, it's a good movie. Not RRR.
This is more like RRR. Yeah, which I still love.
No, it is. It actually is. RRR is a great movie because it's amazing arc too.
Yeah, 3 hours and
amazing character arcs. It does fly by. No, this Gladiator II I think is good. It's a good action movie. It's quite adventurous, and I also think it has a bit of that original Gladiator thing where its appeal is actually wider than just like the teenage boy
For sure.
that's going for like an action movie. Like older folks are gonna like it because the movie takes history seriously enough to be like, oh, I'm interested in Rome. This is the thing that intrigues me. It again has the thing that the original Gladiator has, which is a understanding that your hero should be appealing on multiple, like he should be appealing to men and women. He shouldn't just be a thing for fanboys. Like I don't know, it's come to the point where like
he has no snarky lines.
No, there's no snark, there's none of this bullshit. But there's also like sometimes in a Marvel movie, like how many Marvel movies star Chris Hemsworth, this super handsome guy, and the movie has like, except for the first one where it's the shot of him like shirtless coming out and like Natalie Portman is kind of, oh my goodness, because Branagh puts it in there and he understands classical stuff. Later Marvel movies are so sexless. Like this movie understands that like, oh, Paul Mescal's hot, and he comes out and it's like, oh, look at that handsome guy who could kick ass. Like,
I have a question for you. At times, this Paul Mescal in this film almost reminds me a little bit of sometimes of like a young Mel Gibson.
Okay, I can kind of see it, like Mad Max. In
appearance too, and his kind of like and almost Australian.
No, it's Mad Max.
Some of their speaking, like they kind of like bite the air, like they have they have kind of aggressive jaws.
I think he can have a similar appeal.
Paul Mescal's a good actor. That's again one of my things is that there's certain scenes in this movie specifically, they almost all take place in that gladiator quarters, where he starts giving these little speeches, and you're almost like, oh, I'm witnessing a deeper, richer version of the character work in this movie that I wish I just had a little bit more of that. Just a little bit more of that. Because there's moments you're like, oh yeah, he's a really good actor. And if you just let him cook, it's actually really awesome. You don't always just have to go to Denzel because Denzel is the best. We all know Denzel's the best. Like, he's the living legend actor, right? Like, is there a better actor than Denzel right now?
Yeah.
Probably not. He's like the greatest, right? Especially since like the last generation of greats died away.
I always get what I want. Why did you let him live?
You bought a gladiator, not a slave. My will is my own.
Ah, how blue is your blood? Perhaps the heart of a Roman beats in that chest. The greatest temple Rome ever built, the Colosseum, because this is what they believe in: power. They gather here to watch the strong strike down the weak.
There has to be something else.
There is nothing else.
There has to be another Rome.
There is no other Rome. The dream? The dream of Rome? It's an old man's fantasy.
Who are you? What was your name before you traded it for a Roman one?
You'll never know.
So we've talked a lot about Gladiator II. And we've talked a lot about the first one in conjunction with it, but I'm curious, like, when is the last time you guys watched the original Gladiator? And I'm most curious, I guess, about how your opinion of it has changed or hasn't, or like just not necessarily saying you think it's better than it was when you originally saw it, but just how has that actual view of the movie evolved over the 20 plus years?
So I watched it like the night before I went to see Gladiator II. I just stayed up late and watched it again. And it had been a long time. And then I ended up writing, a piece for the site about it. And it's talking about Maximus, who I think is like the best movie character of the past 25 years. On a level of like, I'm not just saying like, the most nuanced, deeply crafted character put on screen, but really just like if you think about iconic characters, like everyone just knows Maximus. And what blows me away is that over the past years where we have like we live in kind of our franchise world of nonstop, drawing on other existing IP. Maximus is one of the few big Hollywood characters where he's instantly recognizable. He has certain personality traits that people know and like, but he was developed for the movie and he's not based on something else. He's not based on a book or comics or anything like that. But at the same time, Anders, earlier you mentioned in this podcast that you're like, part of his success is that then he starts to feel like he is like a character that exists in something else.
So Maximus is not a guy. I would not say he's like the best movie character and best performance and all that. But what I do agree is that he's one of the few characters who has achieved that iconic status, right? Like, but he's not, because he's not part of like some sort of like franchise IP where there's like a whole bunch of stuff that builds off it. The character that he's most like is like someone like, I don't know, like, and his appeal also to certain young men is like Scarface, like like, or someone like Tony Montana or someone like that, right? Like, or even Tony Soprano or something, a character like that's like an original character for a movie that sort of becomes this like icon. But he's like a much more positive one, obviously.
Can we just sidebar here a second? I'm just trying to think of other original not from an adaptation. So I'm not saying Paul Atreides, or I'm not saying
exactly no adaptation.
Maverick from Top Gun Maverick.
No earlier movie.
Yeah.
So okay,
who would it actually be?
One of my others would be The Bride.
Yeah, The Bride is one of the first that comes to mind.
Partly because she also visually is iconic. In the yellow black jumpsuit.
I think there's several Tarantino characters. Like I think of Rick Dalton and Cliff Booth. They're super memorable. But they also feel real because they're situated in like a real world in that. But like I just get such a kick out of those characters and I want to just hang with them. I think they're hilarious. And Cliff is kind of legendarily cool too, right?
Wait, I'll throw out a character that is possibly that iconic. Would be Daniel Plainview from There Will Be Blood.
I would have said that
with the catchphrases and the.
I would have said that like I probably would have agreed more like 7 years ago, but I feel like There Will Be Blood became like an instant classic, but actually hasn't had the legs that like I feel like if I mention it to my students, they don't know it.
The one that they do know then is probably, or some of them will know, or at least as many as that know Maximus. Anton Chigurh.
But he's adapted. He's from a book.
Yeah.
Oh, you're right.
I know. I was thinking Anton Chigurh is a very memorable character that like looms large, and in a weird way, is an adaptation, but not right. Like Arthur Fleck, like Joaquin's Joker, is actually an original character in like 99%.
Well, I don't know. I'm not going to give 1% to Batman.
No, but you know what I mean. Like,
but I know what you mean. I know what you mean.
He's not the Joker from the comics. Yeah. He's not. He's actually like it's creation that lives in the.
But not even the Joker. You're right.
You got to give someone Anton Chigurh because 99% of people have seen the Coen Brothers.
No, it's true. But so I wouldn't put in there. But I'm just saying that that's actually an iconic performance the last like while. But we can get off that. But it kind of proves the fact that we're just spinning here and. We can only come up with a few.
I know, because then we're even like I'm struggling because I'd be like maybe like Oppenheimer, but he's a real person, like you know what I mean. But like because everything's kind of based on something else.
It's very rare to have a genuinely original work, right? And maybe there's some like, animated movies and things like that. That's different.
It's not Jake Sully from Avatar.
I love
just
Avatar
people, just Avatar, blue people. Everyone knows if I mention blue people, everyone knows that. But you're right, because the argument isn't that Maximus is just like the best developed character, but as a hero and as an iconic figure, like I'm hard pressed to think of someone else.
I think that's argument. That's a good argument.
So, but rewatching it, the amazing thing was just I was like, I loved Gladiator when I saw it. It was like one of my favorite movies when I was like a young man, like teenager, undergraduate, and I hadn't really watched it kind of since that. Probably watched it once since kind of like my youth. I don't remember what year. I'd find it in my journal, but what I loved was just that the movie was still so damn enjoyable. And I could literally just sit down right now and watch it again and like love every minute of it.
And this is partly why it's successful, right? It is the ultimate like kind of like TBS dad movie. Like you can walk into that movie at any point. And you're like,
I gotta watch this scene. I just gotta watch this Gladiator
and you
fight.
can just see it on. It's on TV before the football game on a Sunday afternoon. You lie on the couch, you watch the movie. You know it so well that you don't need to like that's.
And even a lot of the dramatic scenes are so memorable. Like, you know, like thinking of Marcus Aurelius speaking to Commodus, you know, like, your failings are my fault.
You will not be emperor.
And you're like, those are like scenes where you'd be like, okay, I'll just watch this one. This is good.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's the good stuff about it. But it is like Shakespearean. It is kind of like larger than life. People who think of it as like super realistic, like gritty. No, it is sword and sandal epic. Like it's returns that sense of like melodrama and like sort of high
adventure, but it also shows that 2000s gritty for the first decade was a convention and not realism.
Right, of course, using the Stephen Pratt Ryan like shutter speed thing to give that in that opening battle, especially.
So when was the last time you watched it?
Well, I watched it this last weekend as well because I needed to refresh myself because it had been probably a decade before that I watched it.
I watched it a few years ago. It's a movie I watch fairly often just because it's super enjoyable.
Yeah, Anton, I was surprised that you said you'd only seen it maybe one other time since you were young, like in university. Because I think even though I hadn't watched it this time since since my kids were born, I had watched it fairly semi-regularly. Actually, even like it was the kind of film that with traveling and backpacking in the late aughts, I remember it would be like on in a hostel, just on TV, and everybody would just sit around watching it, right? Because it also has a broad, actually weirdly cross-cultural appeal.
I feel like there's just a weird thing of like growing, like no, I shouldn't say growing up. It's just like as you go on, it's like there's movies that I love, and I know I love them, and I would actually really like to rewatch them, but I just like don't go back and like rewatch them because like I rewatched Saving Private Ryan this past June around D-Day. I think it was actually on D-Day on the 80th anniversary. And it like there's a movie again that I watched so many times when I was younger, but I hadn't watched it in so long. And it has nothing to do with like, you know, that you're sort of like, I think I've outgrown this. It's just for whatever reason, you know, there's really only like Star Wars is something they basically watch every couple of years.
Yeah, but so Gladiator fits into one of those extremely rewatchable movies. And rewatchability is one of those things where it's easy to dismiss because it's almost like, well, you're familiar with it, or it's placating, it's soft. There's something kind of squishy and like not serious about the idea of rewatchability, right? A really serious movie is like a 4-hour like Taiwanese movie. Like Brighter Summer Day, really great movie, but this idea that like the greatest movie, my top 10 Sight and Sound ballad is like a movie I've only seen once and I'll only ever watch once because it's like crushing to watch or something. And rewatchability, it's like, but what makes it rewatchable? And I think the appeal of the character, the clarity of the arc, the moral urgency of his quest, like the morality of it is actually easy to to ignore. And it really is part of the reason why he registers so well. It's Anton, you had your line in your essay. It's basically, it is one of the few movies where the ending, the character dies, but it's a happy ending.
Yeah.
Like you're like, oh, he's back with his family. It's like satisfying. But it feels like, good man, get your rest.
I do think you're right. I think that is part of the appeal. I think you're right to put that in there, Anton. I just want to maybe like delve into it a bit because that kind of happy ending is really only popular in a world that has a cosmology where there's an afterlife and things, right? Per se. And at least in the way we're talking about it. And so ironically, that means that the film plays really well to actually like Christian audiences, I think, even though the characters are pagans and actually like probably not very Christian in a lot of ways. And in fact, some of their values aren't even, but you can make that illusion. You're like, yes, this is a person who believes in something. His, belief is validated in the end and all those kind of things. So it is actually a happy ending that actually sort of aligns with like the way most people think of like religion in a positive way.
Because there aren't a lot of movies that portray
Does that make sense?
No, I agree. Like there aren't a lot of movies that portray the afterlife as a reality that's kind of the character inhabits throughout the film on some level.
I think that's how a lot of people in the ancient world just lived their life.
Well, yeah, I think that's why, the Romans were very much like, whether they killed themselves or whatever, like the expectation of the afterlife really informed a lot of things.
It's one thing we didn't mention about the new film, The River Styx.
Oh yeah, no, I was gonna say that too. I wish there was more of that. It was really interesting.
Sorry. That was a very evocative image because it was done in a way that we all know the river Styx from our mythology, but Scott shoots it in a way that gave it an arresting freshness and a little bit creepy.
It was creepy. It genuinely was creepy. I was going to say the movie, weirdly enough, that the original Gladiator reminds me of in its afterlife stuff, which apparently the afterlife stuff was like made up on the fly by like Crowe and Scott to try to make the movie's motivations work. Like apparently they shot all the like murdered family stuff like halfway through the shoot. It wasn't there in the script to begin with, and it was like, we need to clarify this character. It's not like gelling. Which is funny when you have things like that because it seems like such a clear arc, right, in retrospect.
Hey, and that confirms my idea that Crowe, he really shapes that movie.
I've seen other John Logan films. I don't think that he's the main force.
No, I think he's a good writer. Like he wrote Skyfall and stuff, but it's he's Crowe. I think we undersell sometimes big Hollywood stars and how much power they have over shaping their character arcs. Like Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt are great examples of that because they're the producers as well. But we forget how much that's a conversation. It's not just like an author, right? The movie is The Thin Red Line.
Oh, yeah.
And it's because The Thin Red Line is weird. The way with Caviezel and the nature and the permeability. Actually, the other movie then is Passion of the Christ, which takes the Gladiator as the like cue, right? But The Thin Red Line, it has that idea of like a veil of reality, right? That the characters are like in and out, and death, because the omnipresence of death means like the spirit is close, and thus you're peeking into these hidden aspects of reality. And Gladiator has that as like a dialogue with the character. You made the comment where you're like, if Maximus almost is like a dead man walking in aspects of the movie, like he's not quite there sometimes. He's interacting actually already with
makes him almost impossible
with the next. Yeah. And so it gives him this mythic aspect, right? to the character. Maximus really is just awesome. And it's made my affection for Russell Crowe kind of long last. I think Russell Crowe's very good in other movies too. And in some ways you could argue that Maximus isn't even his best performance. Like you could say his work in like The Insider or something is like, I think his
run, that 6-year run from LA Confidential to Master and Commander is really something.
It's about as good as you can get for an actor's
really
run,
is.
Right? Like it's,
but Maximus is, it's his Han Solo.
Yeah.
Yes,
there's lots of other Harrison Ford performances I love, but Han Solo's Han Solo, right? And it's the one that he'll go down with, and I think he'll probably be happy that that's the role he's like forever associated.
I just
with.
thought of the character who is the only other one. It's Jack Sparrow.
Actually, yes.
It's
true.
There you go.
But based on he's not
Jack
in there.
Sparrow characters from the script.
They added him in after. Which is actually true.
Jack Sparrow. So the sequence where Maximus sees his family die really like struck me rewatching it, because I hadn't really thought about that sequence, how that works cinematically. And you're mentioning The Thin Red Line. I even want to bring it up more because you're like, these are films where it's like they're playing, play's not the right word. They're using the conventions of cinema, the fact that we see two separate images and assume that there's some sort of connection or presentness to the two things we see to like convey like an extra sense of consciousness. And Malick does this all the time, like his poeticness and his use of sort of like montage
Through editing.
where you thread in details and they make no narrative sense, but it's to create the sense of like more going on at that moment. And I just thought, I was really struck by it because this time I was like, I actually think that Maximus sees his family. I feel like before I always sort of read this as just Maximus sort of senses something's up. But I actually think that the movie, a sense of presence, a disturbance in the force.
Yeah.
But I actually think the way the movie sets it up is that the cross-cutting is like for him as well as us. Like he's actually seen this. But that allows for like the film's very much about deeply aligning us with Maximus's point of view on things. And if we go to the very first shot, right, where we get the famous hand through the wheat stalks.
And then right after those scenes of his family, when he's then captured, some of the first shots we get are him looking up, right, and seeing Jimon Hansu's character, like, hey, just rest.
Yeah. Like, and he's passing out of consciousness into the afterlife.
And then kind of coming back
and then
forth,
kind of he's slipping back and forth.
Yeah, he's having like a near-death experience, kind of, we would say nowadays in modern language.
An NDE. Yeah. People in the community. I really think there's the Malick thing is not accidental, and
Thin Red Line only came out 2 years before.
Yeah, no, but I also think that Gladiator weirdly helps predict the visual language of New World, and then especially Tree of Life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just funny how Hollywood works that way, but like the editing patterns, the new agey spirituality really becomes like to the fore in Malick's later work. And it's almost like Gladiator like pried that open and allowed everybody to play in that sandbox then of bringing that kind of spiritual editing
into
the like works.
Gladiator's like a good example of sort of like how do you do very mainstream movie, but it has moments of sort of like lyrical filmmaking.
Yeah.
Like where you get an image and the point of that image is not its literal sense. It's like it's the metaphoric connection that's doing. And it uses the afterlife as a way to sort of do that. But that's not a common thing in like a regular Hollywood movie where we're just going to show an image and like its meaning is going to register through, because why are we having that moment before a battle? Like it adds a different dimension to everything that comes in the opening battle. Even the way Maximus looks, he pauses and looks at a little bird fly off. There's
so many little touches.
You just say that and the shot burns into my brain,
moment,
though.
Right?
Yeah, no, the film is so well.
I can even see the look and the
Yep. And I have to say, I've always, even before Game of Thrones, if I had like a battle armor, I would wanted Maximus's German front battle armor with the like full wolf skin on the shoulder stole, like, and the cape and everything. It looks pretty awesome.
In the opening battle, like it's up there with like one of the great like movie battles in that in that era of Saving Private Ryan where you're like, we'll have maximum chaos, but at the same time it's comprehensible. Because there's the moment where it's like I'm watching it and I'm like, okay, this is like I don't know, I didn't clock it, but you're like, we're talking like fractions of second images of like, the sword when it slams into the tree and then he retrieves it later, but we all were aware that that's there and expecting him to get it. Like none of this is sort of confused in a way that sometimes I'm getting like nowadays, like, slower shots, but maximum confusion about like what actually just happened. Who punched who? Like,
yeah, I think that might, going back to my comment of rewatchability, Gladiator is one of the most rewatchable movies of the last couple decades. And I think the clarity of its visual storytelling is a big part of that. I think the pacing is a big part of that. These elements are not accidental. It's not just the idea that it happened to like strike a chord and then now we look back with it in fondness and then that is the thing that drives the rewatchability. This past summer I was on TV and then I tuned in like within the first 5 minutes to The Fugitive and I ended up watching the whole thing. And it's one of those movies that fits where you're like, why is this so watchable. Because
just
there's
the way it's
elements of it
made.
that is unremarkable.
Mhm.
But the unremarkable means it's invisible. So it's like actually peak Hollywood craftsmanship. It's classical filmmaking at its like, oh my goodness, this is so engrossing because it just works and moves.
Maximum clarity, maximum like not drawing attention to itself. Yeah.
But within that structure,
Still having style.
the emotions and the nuance and the style, it's like there are scenes in that movie of Tommy Lee Jones and his performance that are just like so good. And I'm not even talking about the big ones. I'm talking about like these little moments he has where you're like, holy crap, this character performance, you understand so much about him because of the way he says certain lines. And Maximus, you understand so much about him by the fact that he kneels, reaches down, rubs the dirt.
Yeah.
the
I think
sand
if you're
grains between
saying
his
like
hands.
those are interesting that those both roles rightly both won Oscars for.
Yeah, sometimes the Oscars get it. But,
Well, they're especially if they're a measure of craftsmanship and like class, what Hollywood awards. So
Now, a comment on The Fugitive. There's not actually a lot of movies that have amazing where two characters are set like in opposition to each other, and they're both like brilliant, equally brilliant performances. I'm trying to think, but like sometimes they work really well, right? But like The Fugitive is like one of those movies where you're like, the policeman shouldn't be set, or he's U.S. Marshal, but he shouldn't be like a great character.
no, he really shouldn't. Would you consider Gladiator one of those?
Well, I do think Joaquin's Commodus is key to the film. If he wasn't so vile, we would like it adds a lot to us loving Maximus. And then even like Richard Harris's performance as Marcus Aurelius is a great like old wise man performance.
And somebody we haven't mentioned is Oliver Reed.
Yeah,
who died during the filming, but like he is so good in the scenes he's in.
Yeah, there's a lot of great supporting roles in that.
Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained? Is this not why you are here?
Thanks for listening to this episode of us covering Gladiator II. We'll catch you next month, possibly dealing with some spooky Christmas fare with Robert Eggers' Nosferatu remake. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time.
Goodbye, Mr. Bond.
I bid you farewell.